All right, everybody, here we are getting started with patch part 1. So I have all of my materials here on my workspace. You can see I've got my microcontroller, I've got some fabric, embroidery thread, needles, scissors, a seam ripper that can be really helpful for mistakes, my battery. I've got my needle here in my tomato, and my conductive thread. So I'm going to go ahead and finish clearing off my workspace here and get started with the first part. Okay, so the first thing that I'm going to go ahead and do is actually get some of this rabbit hair off of my fabric. And I'm going to start designing my patch. So I always use a stencil because I'm really bad at lettering, like completely illegible. So I'm going to go ahead and start by tracing these letters. You can freehand them. You can design your patch to look like whatever you want. Mine is a little reminder to stop buying single-use plastic, so that's what mine says. While I continue to trace here, I should also mention I actually sewed around my patches before I got started. You can also burn the edges with a lighter just so they don't fray. Maybe I'll add an exclamation point. Yes, much better. There we go. Okay, so there's my microcontroller on my canvas. So now with that needle, I'm going to cut some normal thread. You could make it match the canvas or whatever material you're using. I wanted to use a lighter color this time so that you could actually see what I was doing. Here I am knotting my thread just like you normally would onto my needle. And then I'm going to sew through all of the pads a couple of different times that we're not using. So for instance, you can see the microcontroller is kind of like a button, right? So it's got all these holes, these terminals on the outside. And here I am sewing through them to kind of just like hold my microcontroller in place, which will make my life easier when I'm using the conductive thread. So I'll just quickly do one and then I'll speed through the next one. So I'm going to tie this off. Up. Classic. Let me fix this really quick. All right, so I'm going to tie this off and speed through the rest of the terminals that we're not using. Okay, so now we're ready for the conductive thread. So I'm going to cut myself a piece of thread. You can see the conductive thread actually functions pretty much like normal thread. It can be a little bit wily because it's quite a bit thicker than normal thread. You can run into issues with it getting kind of tied in knots or even coming undone. So you really want to take your time with it. I always use a single strand instead of a double strand, and I'm going to sew through the 0 terminal on our Gemma microcontroller. So here I am. I'm doing the same thing where I'm going around this terminal. So if you'll notice these little holes, right, are, oh, there it goes. Yeah, so sometimes it'll come out of your needle. That's normal. That's just how it goes sometimes. So take your time. Go around that terminal, that brass terminal, a lot of times. I usually go through it at least 5 or 6 times to really make sure that the actual metal of the thread is making contact with that brass, because that's what makes it conductive, right? Is these two metals coming together so that it knows if you're touching your pad, which we're going to sew here in a second. So now we're going to make our own button. So instead of attaching an external button, we're just going to use the conductive thread as a button. So it can sense whether or not your skin is actually touching the thread. So that's how we're making our button here. It's kind of the simplest button we could have made. So I'm just going to go and make some loops, kind of sewing. Ugh, it always comes out of the needle. This always happens. Okay, so now I'm going to go back through to the terminal on my microcontroller again, just to make absolutely sure it is secure. So now I can tie it off on the back. So the most important thing when you're tying off with conductive thread is to, one, make sure the knots are really tight because they do come undone sometimes. The clear fingernail polish we will use here in a second to make absolutely sure that it is glued together. But it's really important that you make sure it's pulled really tight, and then also that you cut off any loose threads, because if you touch a different terminal than the one that you're attached to, you might actually cause a short in your microcontroller. So just make sure that you cut off any extra conductive thread that you have flopping around on the back. Okay, so now it's fingernail polish time. So I've got this fingernail polish. I use clear. Really, any fingernail polish would work. That's fine. Don't paint over the button portion, so that little rounded off area that we've made. If you do that, it won't be able to tell if your finger is touching the pad. So just make sure that you're doing the back, just the knots. All right, so now we wait for about 5 minutes for this to dry. Now the fingernail polish is all dry, so I am going to thread this embroidery floss through my needle, and I am going to start decorating. So if you're interested in learning different embroidery methods, YouTube is a perfect place to find that. Here I'm just using a classic back stitch. So it gives you kind of that like classic embroidered look. It really doesn't matter what you do here. So all kinds of people have done all kinds of stuff. I used to spray paint them instead of embroidering them. That works just as well. You could use really anything that works on fabric. All right, so that's part 1. I will see you back again in part 2, where we will start coding our microcontroller.